Pledge of Allegiance, please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We had one person approach us relative to public comment, but we're going to let that take place during the discussion of that item. So Tammy will lay it. Any other public comments? Now we'll go on to approval of the minutes from the September 19th meeting. What are your wishes? Moved by Chair Gibbs to approve. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
That motion carries. Thanks. So we have Supervisor Reynolds participating by WebEx and the 5 members present here. We will proceed. Without objection, we're going to take items 6 first and try to run through those and then go to the budget discussion. Is there an objection? All right, if not, first item is 6A1, consideration to include additional 1.1 FTE deputy sheriff position in the 2025 budget pursuant to contractual agreement with the Village of Rib Mountain.
I can start, Mr. Chair, and if you have any specific questions, any committee members, Chief Deputy Milhausen is here, but this worked its way through the normal process. Pursuant to your budget, it was presented to, we had an educational presentation actually first to the Public Safety Committee, and then earlier this week they recommended adoption in the budget. Again, it's pursuant to a contract that exists with the Village of Rib Mountain. Not to jump back to 5A, but I'll foreshadow a little bit. It is built into the budget as a new FTE, but essentially it's that contractual obligation with the village provides payment for that position. Anything you want to add, Chief Deputy?
Any questions? Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick, maybe procedural. Is this an ongoing contract, and what happens with that position in the event that Rib Mountain decides to go their own way? What happens to that position?
So it's an ongoing position. So this would be the 3rd position out there, and they've begun talks of a possible 4th. As you know, with them being a village, they're obligated to provide law enforcement services. So this is the route that they started when they were a town and now have continued in more coverage throughout the day. What would happen if for some reason this was to dissolve? Obviously, they would have to form a police department or contract with somebody else. What we have always said that we would do through attrition, those positions would either come back to the sheriff's office through our attrition of retirees or somewhere else in the sheriff's office, or in the unfortunate situation, we may have to lay somebody off. But with the attrition that we typically have and the shortages throughout the sheriff's office, I don't see that being something that would be realistic, but it is a possibility.
I would just request administration, and Administrator Leonard and I have had a discussion, and I've had a brief discussion with Chair Billups to make sure that as we're looking at these agreements with other communities, that we look at all of our indirect costs. Those indirect costs would be internal to the Sheriff's Department, but also those internal costs associated with the governance of the county, including HR, legal, and other costs, to make sure that we are truly recouping all of our direct and indirect costs associated with those positions, and would ask that an evaluation be done relative to how we charge those out for all positions going forward, to make sure that we're covering those costs. Because as our employees grow, so do our expenses and our obligations, and I just want to make sure that we try to recoup those where appropriate. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just as a follow-up, I know the contract goes through 2030. Are we going into a contract for a fixed price, or is this an actual price which includes the increases?
So this is true and actual cost. It makes reference to the labor agreement with the Deputy Sheriff's Association. So that will increase whatever the county settles on the agreement with the labor agreement with the county or with the Deputy Sheriff's Association. So what may also go up right now, we have built in, this was additional from the new contract that didn't have in the past was a fuel surcharge and maintenance on vehicles. They own them, but they also are take-home squads for our deputies because many of them are on special teams, dive, SWAT, things like that. That's a benefit to the sheriff's office and the rest of Marathon County, not just the village of Rib Mountain. So they're not paying all actual fuel cost, but there is a fuel cost of fuel and insurance of $400 per vehicle per month. That was not something that was done previous when they were a town, but now that they're a village, we're trying to recoup more of those costs. To Chair Robinson's point, that's what we're trying to make it more of. It's not 100% that as if they were a police department for sure, because there's other overhead that we're getting a benefit from these also. They can fill overtime shifts in the jail. They can fill overtime shifts on the road for the sheriff's office, things like that. So we are seeing a benefit from the sheriff's office perspective. It's not just a benefit to Rib Mountain.
So pursuant to our rules, we need to approve those positions. So what are your wishes? This came out of public safety with, I think, a unanimous vote yesterday. So what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs?
Make a motion to approve and move to the full board for its consideration.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Next, we'll move on to item 2, update relative to the interim tax foreclosure effort and remaining tax delinquent property list. Update relative to enforcement actions against property at 281 Grand Avenue in the city of Schofield, and consideration to direct staff to move forward with initiation of tax foreclosure process.
I can start, and then I know Connie has some updated information. So in your packet is a document that I think will be of interest. It's called the Counter Book. Now, the report in your packet is something that was run as of the 27th of September, and that begins on page 13. But kind of where perhaps we want to start in terms of setting where we are today is the last page of that document. That Counter Book is on page, bear with me, page 245 of your packet. But Connie has run an updated report today just to kind of talk through some of the changes that have taken place. And essentially, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Connie, but what that document runs for us is all of the individual parcels that have tax certificates issued by year are set forth on that summary page that's up on the screen and on the summary document that's being handed out today. Thank you, Erica. So as people come in, and they do come in often, if you spend some time near the treasurer's office to pay their taxes and any back taxes, those numbers can be relatively fluid in terms of when you run a report. But again, it lays out tax certificates, the real estate back taxes, owed, special assessments on that are delinquent as well, and then a total. So you'll see on the document on the screen, 2024 is probably a good place to start because those are probably the taxes that people are, if they are delinquent, are most likely to come in and pay because they are newly delinquent. So you'll see just from the couple of, just about 2 weeks from when this report was run until today, that amount dropped by well over 170 people, 170 parcels, I should say, have come in to become current. So that's kind of what the document is. You can see how it's organized as you scroll through those 240 odd pages, essentially by parcel with then individual years listed relative to delinquency. So with that, I'm sure there's stuff that I missed or was inaccurate. Connie, you want to take it from there?
So basically, the counter book it's a snapshot of the parcels that still have delinquent taxes, and the real estate is the face actual tax dollar amount, not with interest and penalty. The specials were already paid out to the municipalities, so we don't have to do anything with that. We're just collecting them, and that's part of the full tax bill. So right now, as you look at those, tax years were written off. So 2013 is actually the sale year of 2012 tax year. So that's kind of how it runs, and that's why you see 2024. That's actually the 2023 tax bills sale of 2024 that happened in September 1st. So this changes consistently. So we actually started off, I believe, with like 1498 and certificates issued in 2024. We are now down to 1319. So you can see that significantly people are coming in to pay their taxes. So those are the most current. So as of right now, we could technically take properties up to 2021, which is showing like 315 parcels. So, but like I said, we consistently keep losing numbers because people are paying their taxes more frequently now than before. And I just want to let you know that on September 25th, we took 18 parcels for in-rem process. We still need to write off $460,623.92 off of these tax years. That has not been done yet, only because we needed to make sure that the county was in ownership of these parcels. And we do still have one outstanding parcel that has 30 days to pay. So he has till the 25th of October. So that one is not reflected in here either.
Okay. Questions? Chair Gibbs.
Connie, the new report doesn't show the report that was in the packet shows 2010, 11, and 12 with certificates on 22 properties, 46 properties, and 55 properties. And I know that not all of those properties were taken, and I do understand that those have to be effectively written off because they're more than 10 years old. But my real concern is, we see a significant number of properties that are on the verge of going 10 years old, and there's specials on those. And the amount of dollars that are, that are still out there, where are we in the process of looking at a process that's going to manage and minimize the amount of properties that we write off because they're over 10 years? And how do we get a handle on this? Because it seems at this point that we've made very little progress, in the last 3 years in taking of these properties, and it continues to balloon, in my opinion, as far as the property taxes that we're having to write off because they're getting over 10 years old, and or the specials that we're writing off. And that does not, the report, as I understand it, does not include the interest and penalty that was on the court docket. That 400,000 only represented 197,000 of actual real estate taxes, and that came from 2010, 11, 12 also. So I'm really concerned about what progress are we making, and how do we move the needle so that this tax burden is not being shared by the rest of the taxpayers.
So as of right now, like I said, we continue to get properties being paid in full, which is interest and penalty, all given to the county at this time. We had 50 parcels. Like I said, we started with 38, and we only took 18 of them. So off of that first 50 list. But it also took us a long time to get to this point, as we should have taken the properties back in November. But because they kept changing the Act 216, that put a stop on extending this process. So we currently will be submitting 89 letters out for 89 additional parcels for phase 2. And there's about 125 more parcels that are going to Runkle this week for tax research. So my intention is to get those letters out this month so that the properties can be taken probably early February of 2025 because of the 90 days and the 60 days. And I just wanted to let you know that there are at least 20 properties or more that are considered slivers within Marathon County that are part of that list. So those keep getting written off every year. We need a direction on where to go with the parcels. Do we, because it's due to survey problems, do we send that to CPZ to help us with it? Do we take the parcels on a tax deed and then just give that sliver to the adjacent owners? But then you have to change the parcel, the mapping, so that it reflects on that owner's parcel. So those have to be dealt with. So just looking for a direction on where we want to go with those. And I also just want to reiterate that we have several properties that are contaminated that the county does not want to take. One of them is in Marathon, and we are working on a warrant on that parcel. So that is still in progress. But like I said, consistently we get owners coming in and paying off their parcels. I also just want to let you know that in the past, when I started as treasurer, we had 98 total payment agreements that were out there. Now, these payment agreements were set up as you're supposed to be paying off as you go each month. You get a percentage that you have to pay off, but there was no set year, like within a year or 2 years on this original agreement. And you were also supposed to keep your taxes current. That was not happening. So there was 76 of those 98 agreements that were satisfied, which means people pay their taxes in full and they're good to go. But we also canceled 21 of them because they were not being in compliance with the actual first agreement that was issued. And as of today, we only have one payment agreement. There is nobody else on the agreement because the taxes are too difficult for them to pay, or they can't make the monthly payment plus the first installment and second installment payments in the current tax year. So we've tried to go that route, but because those two components were not being satisfied, we were getting a lot of NSF checks, which means we were just basically monitoring the parcels, and it was very time consuming to do that. So
I would maybe request that we look at all those properties that are 8 years and older, because they potentially, if there are hiccups in the process, we could get to a point where we're writing off taxes if we could get a plan to make sure we've addressed all of those. I would also ask Corp Counsel to look at and research the issue of specials. Is there a way for us to continue specials, particularly those that were improvements to the property? Specials may include utility improvements. Is there a way for us to recover those or continue those as a lien or some other way so that we don't have to write those off when we buy those from the local units of government? And then I would also request that we take a look at those properties that are do not take. Given my experience with the Department of Natural Resources working on environmental cleanups, I think that there are some mechanisms by which we can minimize the county's liability and take them. And we've got properties like the Weisenbrenner property in in Marathon City where somebody's generating an income to someone, but we're not the someone receiving it. So there may be some ways for us to work around and limit the county's liability while removing the burden of buying the tax bill each year and actually recouping some income. So I'd like to, over a period of time, so the question that I would ask of administration and you, Connie, is what resources do we need to achieve this? Because we basically wrote off over $100,000 of taxes and specials for 10, 11, and 12 with no action on the part of the county. And, you know, if we were able to recoup some of that, that could go a long way in funding positions or support necessary to get the work done.
One of the requests that I actually have is I need information from the board as to what parcels you identified as not taking. Because when I came in as treasurer, I was not able to get that information. The only property that I know of as of right now is the Weisenberger property, which I'm doing a warrant on. But I do not have the list of the properties the county chose not to take.
I'm not aware of any list either. Perhaps I appreciate the suggestion from Mr. Chair relative to identifying what resources we need to bring to bear on this. I don't want to lose sight of one question that was raised, what to do with specifically how to address remnant parcels or the slivers. My sense, and certainly should the will of this committee be different, please let me know and we'll work to affect whatever your specific will is. But I'm looking on page, here, I'll just pick one, page 21. My sense from a quick review, I don't know much about this specific property. In fact, I know nothing about it. But there are two things that strike me about it. One, it lists 500 Forest Street as its address. And two, the amount of tax due is less than $10 each year. I mean, certainly we should look into this and figure out what the solution is. But when you contrast that to the property that I think, Mr. Chair, you want to talk about in a minute, where there's between a couple of delinquent tax years, $120,000 of back taxes, this strikes me as, if we focus on slivers, it's like stepping over dollars to pick up pennies. So not a good use of time. So my thought process, based on what you just shared, Mr. Chair, is that we'd put together a plan relative to those parcels that are, to your point, about to have their back taxes written off, and really address everything moving forward from that point, ignoring, and say ignoring, but not prioritizing, at least for now, the slivers, what we identify as, for lack of a better way of pulling these out, something that has a very small tax bill. It just doesn't strike me as a good use of time. So we can do that and bring you back kind of an assessment. I know, just thank you to Connie's staff for sharing the counter book. I think it can be exported in an Excel document. I'm not an Excel wizard, but I know a couple of people who are far more skilled, and I'm sure we can sort and pull those things out and identify kind of what those steps are. And I just want to make sure I understand, Connie, we have 89 going out in the next week with letters?
Hopefully by the end of the month, yes.
Okay.
But I just want to
sorry.
reiterate to the board too that it is tax season. So my staff and I are working diligently to get that done.
Yeah. So 89 by the end of the month. What was the kind of the next phase you had said? 100
There's
and
about 125 in there.
going to Runkle?
Yes. I just also want to let you know that I did mention the slivers only because they're consistently on there all the time. Yes, they do get written off, but that's not our priority. Our list consists of the worst properties with the highest dollar amounts first. We are going after those properties. But I also want to to know that the ones that were written off were also part of the ones the county does not want to take. So it was a significant dollar amount for just the Weisenberger property, because they have 3 parcels. So I just want the board to know that we are going after the highest dollar amount versus the lower dollar amount, and obviously the years, but that is our process. The slivers is just something that needs to get addressed. It has never been addressed, and it needs to be. And when you mentioned the fact that it was in the care of Marathon County in the past, I did reach out to the previous treasurer, and she indicated that those are part of the slivers. So they put it into the Marathon County's address in order to get a property listed for that parcel because there was a PIN number on it. So that's what happened in the past, so we just have to correct that moving forward, but it does need to get addressed at some point.
I would just, again, I think that the do not take list was an informal list because I remember sitting down with Lorraine Beiersdorf when she was treasurer, with Lauren Brumberg, who was the West Central Region's Brownfield coordinator, and I at that time worked in the Northern region in the remediation redevelopment program, and we would look at those properties that were in the Bureau of Remediation and Redevelopment's tracking system as either spills, leaking underground storage tanks, or environmental repair fund sites. But I think that there have been significant changes over the last 15, 20 years relative to limiting the liability of local governments to take those that would, if we follow the proper procedures, we can take them, reduce or eliminate the back taxes and potentially redevelop those properties, taking advantage of federal and state brownfield grants. So I think we should bring that list in and formalize it if there may be a mid-state landfill that we don't want to take because it will be difficult to ever redevelop on top of a sludge pile. But there may be others that we should take.
Yes, and I would greatly appreciate that list, and I'm also working with the DNR on any properties of contamination that I'm not aware of. So, because they also want to be in the know, and I'm also working with the city because they've had questions about a couple of the properties as well. So I am working with those entities as well.
Any other questions? All right, then if we could go to the specific property referenced in the agenda. Do you want to take the lead, or do we turn it over to the?
Sure, I'll kick it off, and then certainly Laura can elaborate. But just in terms of the specific property that's agendized, if you, in the counter book, it's on page 26. 281 Grand Avenue, you can see the back taxes that are owed, again, at least as of the date that this report was run, so I don't have any updated information on that. But this is, I think, as Treasurer just alluded to, this is one of those properties where the amount of back taxes is significant. But it's not simply an issue for the county. Well, we're not involved, I should say, relative to this property, simply from a perspective of back taxes. It also has been the subject of engagement from Corporation Counsel's office, specifically via the Health Department. So there's a memo in your packet beginning on page 246 relative to the Northern Mobile Home Park and some, again, that involvement we've had from a public health standpoint and specifically human health hazards. It walks you through, thank you to Laura and Kate for putting this together, it walks you through kind of some of the situations, the condition of the property. There are pictures in that accompany that memorandum. Certainly had an impact on local law enforcement, and I know the city of Schofield is likewise interested in having that property, at least from a human health hazard standpoint, cleaned up. So that's kind of the background. Laura, you want to offer anything? Laura and Kate can kind of go through their involvement, and then we'll talk about, from kind of the legal perspective, what are the potential next steps?
Okay, so in your packet, I believe it's on page 245 or 246 in the packet, there's a memo on Northern Mobile Home Park. Northern Mobile Home Park is operated by a company named Sustainable Resources LLC, and that is owned by a gentleman named Christopher Reeves. The park has approximately 50 abandoned homes on the property, all in varying states of disrepair, and are exceedingly hazardous and are in exceptionally poor condition. Homes have broken roofs, there are damaged floors, there's fire damage, water damage, missing skirting, vandalism, drug paraphernalia, human waste, and many structures are open and accessible. There are also abandoned vehicles, open sheds, strewn garbage, and tall overgrown grass that provides habitat for rodents and other animals present in and around the homes. You can see there's an inspection history and violations. This is not the full list of all the correspondence and interactions we've had with the owner. This is just the enforceable actions and the actions that the health department has taken. And then on page 3, it talks about the public health risks. So when you have open and unsecured mobile homes, it makes it so that their property is vulnerable to vandalism, looting, and potential unsafe habitation. The last couple times that my colleague Kate and I have gone, we have seen that there was evidence of habitation. There were drug and alcohol paraphernalia was also visible in the homes. There is inadequate fencing, so there is a gate, but you can just walk right around the gate in order to get in. It allows for unrestricted access to the property. We have had a lot of interaction with Mountain Bay Police, who have reported that they have found children and adolescents playing on the property, and I am very concerned about children going into homes with drug paraphernalia, broken glass, and potentially the home may not be structurally sound. There's overgrown grass, so there are rodents, and is a pest infestation. There's garbage and refuse everywhere, and broken glass, debris. It creates unsafe conditions in the walkways and between the homes. And there's also a great deal of standing water found in open containers, which again is a concern because it's a breeding ground for mosquitoes, hopefully for not much longer. Under Wisconsin Statute 254.012, it constitutes a human health hazard. So we have gone through an enforcement action on, let's see, it was on we've gone to court, and the hearing was held on 9/10, and Sustainable Resources was ordered to abate, remove, and correct all identified human health hazards within 30 days of the order. That is Thursday, October 10th, and if they are not abated, Marathon County will have ability to enter the premises to abate, remove, or correct all human health hazards and collect the cost of abatement or removal from Sustainable Resources, including imposing the costs as a special assessment, a special charge, or other levy. So you will see in the back of the packet there are some pictures it's just a small sampling of the pictures that we've collected. You can see there are open homes, broken glass, vandalism. There's no electricity and water currently. It is not a safe place for people to be living. We have provided 2 recommendations to discuss. The first recommendation is to allocate resources to support the mitigation of the individual human health hazards. You can see that what is required is boarding up structures, fencing, initial mowing, waste removal, and the total cost of that would be approximately $100,000. One thing to note of this is that these are temporary measures and would need upkeep and maintenance, so it would be ongoing. There would be ongoing costs required in order to ensure that the human health hazard was mitigated. The other option would be it would be a more permanent solution, would be to remove the structures completely. There is an elevated cost to that. It would approximately be about $325,000 to $500,000. Excuse me. For the entire site, the elevated cost is primarily due to the need for additional safety precautions because we're concerned about asbestos is likely present within the homes. So it requires asbestos in order to remove. It requires specialized handling and disposal. So I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
If I can just add a little bit more context, that Laura alluded to the fact that we have gone to court on this. We've actually gone to court twice. We went, and previously they were issued, this entity was issued a similar order quite a while ago to essentially mitigate the human health hazard, and the manner in which they were deemed to abate that human health hazard was to kind of, what consistent with what Laura talked about before, essentially make the structures inaccessible. So that was their attempt. The mobile home park was closed. People were not allowed to reside there any longer. However, clearly, as Laura alluded to, that's not a permanent solution, as individuals have continued to find ways to not only get into the real property itself, but also into the structures on the site. So again, there's kind of two issues before you, or I should say there's two ways in which we could become involved in this. One is just on the human health hazard side, which essentially is a question of what approach do we take and what money do we identify to move forward. The second side is, again, related to the counter book and the fact that there are significant back taxes owed on this property, that we could proceed with issuing the requisite notices to move forward with the tax foreclosure process. I hope that provides a little bit of background as to why we're here. They are, as you can see from the counter book that you had before you and where this property fell, they are relatively young, or if I were to characterize them in terms of their non-payment, they have stayed, they're 3 years delinquent, as opposed to some of the other parcels that we've talked about that are far more. But the dollar amounts are quite significant. So if the committee wishes to have us proceed with the requisite notices for tax foreclosure, we can certainly look into doing that.
Are there any questions of administration? Chair Gibbs.
So if we wanted to, wouldn't we have to have ownership of the property before or a court order to be able to remove the mobile homes that are there to mitigate the health concerns that we have? So I guess more of a legal question: do we have to have a court order to be able to remove them? I think we would, and if not, at least ownership of the underlying asset, the land.
That's a great question. So on the court order that was given on the September 10th, that was given us permission to remove, abate, correct all human health hazards. So that would include removing any of the housing.
That was after 30 days, right? So the 30 days, I think, is up tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
So absent a flurry of activity cleaning up those things, we would have legal authority pursuant to that court order. I see Dan nodding. Yeah.
Correct. The only thing is, what I don't know is, are any of these properties currently being occupied?
No, there's nobody there. There's no electricity, sewage, water.
Okay, so yes.
Is the answer not legally?
That's correct, yes.
So they may be occupied, but they are not legally occupied. So I think I don't know if legally there is a difference.
Yeah, so we would have to look into that, especially for the specific property that we know or assume that somebody might be residing there, although maybe not legally, but we would see if they have any sort of rights as well.
The other thing that, just from a timing perspective, regardless of what strategy we adopt, if these things are going to be cleaned up via Marathon County, Laura and I have had this conversation just to confirm whether or not we could use internal resources. My sense is not. We've had the highway department in the past perform similar sort of demolition and cleanup work. However, given the concerns that Laura referenced, I'm not sure that's viable here. The second part is putting out a request for proposal to have someone do this work. Clearly, the amount that we're estimating for this work is going to be above our procurement threshold, so a request for proposal would be appropriate, and we can start that work in the near future. But really, the question we have to the answer we need to come up with is, from my perspective, is one of strategy, and then likely one of identifying a funding source.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just, have we ever been contacted by the owner of any intentions, like, hey, I'm working on it, or have we had any communication with the owner from the treasurer's office or the health department?
We've had email communication, and there's been intention to clean it up, but we have not seen any movement on any kind of abatement within the last 3 years.
The treasurer has been contacted by Chris and a representative for him on the back taxes, and I have given him payoffs. We have received a payment of $5,000 as of yesterday, and there was an email sent that he plans to pay $500 per day. So he is in the understanding of knowing where the property is on the in rem process or tax deed. Regardless, his property is not listed in phase 2, it's in phase 3, which has not had any research done yet. And I just want to let the board know that if you want me to go to the properties that have the most significant years of delinquency, I have to do those first. But secondly, this is a city of Schofield's parcel. So when I have other municipalities talking to me about their parcels that have problems, I did not push those forward. So then this would be, to me, feels like moving this forward would be favoritism to the city of Schofield. I just want that to be reiterated to you. Because I've told other municipalities that have problems with their parcels that they have to wait till I get to it.
I think that this is a policy discussion for the board, and if the feeling of the board is that we need to move on this, I think it is. My concern would be that we would start the NREM process and they would make the payment relative to bringing it to minimizing the exposure, getting to 2 years delinquent. So can we take this in a phased approach and begin the process of taking title while we proceed with work, and if there's no improvement, we could do the work as a under a special assessment and move forward. My fear is it will play games with us, and I dealt with this when I was chair of the Board of Health years ago, and it just seemed like the owner was disingenuous in relative to his desire to clean it up and to rectify the situation, and he would do the minimum possible in which to do it. And he has the ability to, at any point in time, show that he, A, will pay the back taxes, and B, do the appropriate action from a human health hazard perspective. And I think what we have to do is respond to the request that we've received from the city of Schofield, and this was a request of the county to work with them relative to the property, and there may be some other alternatives to address the situation, but I think this is one where the human health hazards and public health issues would mitigate or would basically result in us wanting to take action. I see Supervisor Conway has raised his hand. If you'd like to grab a mic.
Thank you, sir. I'm here because this is my district, and I was at City of Schofield council meeting yesterday. We talked about this a little bit. But you hit it right on the head there. This property owner has been disingenuous in the past. We've been living with this well before 2021. He's had other properties in other counties that have gotten just as ugly. Mountain Bay Police right now is fining them $450 per day. It's over $50,000 in fines from them just because of the health hazards that they have. So holding your breath for them to come and pay it right at the last second, I think, is not going to happen. And going in, and it's going to be more expensive, we know that, but going in and taking all it out is very much the best option. I mean, you've seen the pictures, kids playing in there, and this is not out in the boonies. This is on the center of Schofield, right on the main drag. There's a restaurant right across the street from this, and they have rats. They have there's small businesses. There's a nail salon right next door. U-Haul's been putting in huge infrastructure improvements right next door. So they're trying to get it better, and this has really been an anchor on them for years and years and years. So I very strongly advocate spending the money and not doing a $100,000 Band-Aid that is going to get broken into again and again and again, and just settle it once and for all.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One question I have on this is if we go ahead and do what's needed to mitigate the health concerns here, I know we incur that cost. Are we passing that cost on to the owner, or how does that work? Because then I'd have a fear that the owner is trying to do a workaround for us to clean up his property and then still maintain the property and maintain ownership. So that's a concern that I'd have.
So pursuant to the court order, the owner would have ultimate liability. We could go after him for that amount. The only problem is that it depends on his assets and financial wherewithal, and so that could be significant or completely insignificant as well. One thing I will say, though, in addition to their obligation to clean up the property within 30 days, if they don't comply with the court order by tomorrow, there's also going to be a forfeiture of $49,500. And so we would be able to immediately start acting on recovering that piece as well. Again, all of that depends on what is the owner's financial wherewithal. Some of the things we could do is conduct a supplemental exam to see what assets, if any, the LLC owns. Depending on whether the LLC is undercapitalized, whether corporate formalities were followed, whether or not the LLC was actually treated as an LLC, or whether the owner just kind of tapped into its stuff like that. We could potentially pierce the corporate veil and go after the owner personally. That's obviously very subjective whether or not we would be able to do that. I'm not really sure. That would depend on the facts. But then again, too, is like I'm not really sure how much the owner would be worth, and so those would all be factors we need to consider to see how much the county could recoup. Furthermore, any amount that's owed to the county can also be added under the extra costs if we were to proceed under a in rem or just a regular foreclosure action. But that also depends on what the value of the property is. So I think it has $120,000 in outstanding taxes plus whatever the cleanup cost. I'm not really sure if the property would be worth enough to cover all of that.
Chair Gibbs.
So just a question, Corp Counsel, 49,000, is that placed on bond right now? Or that would be just a judgment against them, additional judgment?
That will be an additional judgment against the LLC entity.
Yeah, my real concern is that if we start the tax deed process or in rem, either way, I think it really is what we need to do. Take this property by in rem or tax deed. I know it's outside of the normal process, but I think the health concerns that have clearly been demonstrated here trump any process that we use, because it clearly needs to be addressed. So I would make a motion that we direct administration and the Treasurer's Department to start tax deed process, and then we'll proceed with cleanup.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lammer. Supervisor Poole.
Yeah, I just had a quick question for funding. Is this eligible for any of the remaining ARPA dollars to do?
My sense is that certainly would be the case. Again, just going back to what our process is going to have to be, if the motion were to prevail, and I assume that the tax deed reference is to either tax deed or in rem, whichever one is more expedient. But provided we move forward with that, my sense right now is that concurrently we would put out a request for proposal to at least understand what the costs would be to proceed with the cleanup for that property. That information would then inform, first and foremost, how much money we need, and then we would come back with potential funding options for you to move forward with a further course of action. But again, step one is really, are we going to try to do two things, the concurrent approach, or just keep us in the human health hazard lane. Certainly, that's a policy issue for this committee, and you have a motion and a second. My sense from an administration standpoint is also gives us a little bit more leverage. I mean, in a perfect world, this individual would do two things. One, pay off their back taxes and interest and penalties, and two, clean up the property. And proceeding with both the human health hazard side and the tax foreclosure side, I think at least demonstrates what the intent of the county is.
And I would be in favor for the permanent cleanup and to start foreclosure immediately.
So are we operating under an inspection warrant right now? And I raise that issue because in order to get a timely and meaningful bid relative to demolition, we'll need to get on site and potentially do an inspection. So do we have an active inspection warrant?
So as a part of Wisconsin State Statute 254, we have the ability, if there's a suspicion of a human health hazard, to go on site and inspect.
So do we have that right now?
We do have the ability to do that under current Wisconsin State statute.
That would get at the issue, Supervisor Poole, of the timeliness of ARPA was we'd have to have a contract in place by the end of the calendar year, and if we can't get in and inspect, we may be delayed relative to that. So there are all these nuances relative to timing. Dan, did you have?
Just with inspection, I know this is probably like minor, but we'd have to wait until their timeline as provided in the court order would expire.
Tomorrow.
Well, actually, we can talk later. But my understanding is that with the human health hazard, we have the ability to go in and inspect at any time from our 251. So we'll clear that up. But we're not going to go until tomorrow anyway.
So we have a motion to basically direct administration of the Treasurer's Office to begin the process of taking it through tax foreclosure and looking at the other issues at the site. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right, we will move on to approval of claims and question costs for June, July, August, and September. We noticed that this was a request that was brought to me that we oversaw with the transition from one finance director to another, and we've corrected it. And you've received the information. What are your wishes? Chair Gibb.
Make a motion to approve.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor of approval of payment, approving the claims for June, July, August, and September will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Claim disallowance for John White. Dan, is that you? Okay.
All right, 1 second. Requesting a claim disallowance for John White based on an ERD complaint he also filed. So this is kind of a double duty. So the WMIC is asking us to disallow this claim.
So we have a letter recommendation from our insurance carrier, and I think you've all
That's
seen some
correct.
information on this in the past. What are your wishes? Or any questions? If there are no questions, what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion consistent with our insurance carrier to disallow the claim by claimant John White.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marshall. Any discussion? Discussion, if not, all those in favor of denial of the claim will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. We're moving on to 6B, acceptance of donation for the Regional Forensic Science Center. Information was in the packet. It's $1 million grant or grant from the Greenheck Foundation over
Correct.
3 payments.
Correct. So there is a budget transfer document laying out the purpose, which is evident from the item on your agenda, but it is some part of the fundraising effort that we had relative to the Regional Forensic Science Center, the very generous donation from the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. As the chair alluded to, it's the first of 3 payments, but the document allows for essentially the authorization to accept the full $1 million donation to go into the appropriate fund.
Supervisor Poole,
Move for acceptance of the donation for the Regional Forensic Science Center.
is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of acceptance of the donation, the transfer of the funds, will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Consideration of resolution to award or to amend the 2024 annual budget to accept award funds under the 2024 Bureau of Justice Assistance Smart Prosecution Grant. Again, it's in your packet. Went to the public safety yesterday, was recommended for approval.
Certainly can provide background, and I see DA Whetstone is here as well, but the resolution is on page 257 of your packet. It's up on the screen. The District Attorney's Office applied for a grant through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Smart Prosecution Program grant, relative to diversion pre-filing program, and they were awarded that grant. So this would require a budget amendment. We would then sufficiently build that in moving forward to future budgets. But certainly if there's any additional questions relative to operations, I defer to the district attorney. But in terms of process, it is a budget amendment.
Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to recommend to the full board an amendment to the budget and accept the awarded funds under the 2024 Bureau of Justice Assistance Smart Prosecution Grant and thank them.
Seconded by Supervisor Poole. Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the motion to accept or to amend the budget to accept the award will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Consideration of entering into a loan agreement with Bug Tussle to facilitate broadband expansion. This issue is brought back to the board earlier this summer. There was a request for conduit bonding in the tune of $12.5 million to facilitate the expansion with $8 million plus carrying and other capitalized interest costs associated with or $5 million associated with the 2021 conduit borrowing issue to lay 190 miles of fiber and construct 16 towers, and then $3 million plus cost associated with the Leather Camp project, which serves Croninwater, Knowlton, and Gunther. Based upon concerns that were raised by the county board, the issue was brought back, and administration worked with Bug Tussle on a term sheet that lowered the bonding request to $8 million. They had requested 8.5, and we said we were capped at 8, and they negotiated the terms of the agreement. The updated terms, based upon recent negotiations after the Extension Economic Development Committee met last week, were to basically proceed with an $8 million loan out of the county's reserves, with that being paid out as the expenditures are incurred, and so there would need to be documentation for it. There would be a 5-year period with no principal payments, but they will begin paying 1 year into it. The interest payments based upon 5.4% interest charge, which is consistent with the local government investment fund. And it would, after that, the principal would be paid based upon a 30-year amortization schedule with a balloon payment after 12 years total. So in 2037, I believe, there would be a balloon payment for that amount. And we would have the collateral agreements in place, pledging the assets to the county as first creditor, or first as a secured creditor. Administrator Leonard or Dan, you've been involved in the recent discussions. Anything you'd like to add?
There is as was alluded to, a revised term sheet. The original term sheet is immediately before the revised sheet, but the revised document begins on page 262 of your packet. As the chair referenced, the loan amount, the interest rate, repayment schedule are all set forth. The project timeline, the only additional piece on there relative to project timeline is referenced no longer than 18 months from the date of the agreement to get the services in place. Also ensuring that not only do we have the collateral and security that was consistent with the first project, but also that the access agreement that was part of that underlying conduit bond would likewise apply here. Relative to the schedule, Bug Tussle provided the amortization schedule that is likewise in your packet on page 265, laying out, as the chair referenced, when those interest payments would come due, as well as the final balloon payment, which is referenced on the document as well, for 10/1 of 2036. If there are any questions, certainly try to answer them, but I think in terms of next steps, should this committee wish to move it on to the full board for consideration, that would be a motion. My intent ultimately would be to draft a resolution for consideration if it does go to the full board that essentially authorizes staff to proceed with executing the documents consistent with whatever term sheet the board approves. But this most recent revision to the term sheet was following conversations that both Attorney Adzik and I had with representatives from Bug Tussle based on the conversation at the board.
Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I do, one of the questions that arose during some of those discussions with the Corp Counsel and administration was whether or not, because this alludes to two different programs or two different projects, one being the Leather Camp project and the other being the original 2021 198-mile plus tower project, is the concern that those projects be cross collateralized and not be one or effectively being collateralized against each other, along with an agreement by Hilbert Communications, the parent corporation. And I understand that was agreed to. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what we talked about is that in the new loan agreement, we would have a provision that a default under this $8 million obligation will also constitute a default under each of the projects, both the Leatherman and the 2021 project.
Any other questions? What are your wishes?
If I can, Mr. Chair, one comment I neglected to make. We did reach out, and I think this was made clear at the Extension Education Economic Development Committee, but we reached out to our financial advisors to inquire whether a loan from the general fund would have any impact, or they would foresee an impact on our bond rating, AA1 bond rating. The response we received after their consideration was that it would not, which is consistent with the opinion they gave relative to entering into a conduit bond.
I misspoke earlier. I said the last payment would be in in 2037. It will actually be 2036. So we will be receiving, under this, $432,000 of interest payments beginning 2026. Any other questions? Not, what are your wishes? What are your wishes? What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion that we approve and move to the full board for its consideration the loan agreements and direct administration, if approved by the board, to enter into those agreements.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marshall. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the resolution will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, we will move on to the item relative to 6B4. It deals with the purchase of county-owned property by the city of Wausau. My preference would be to deal with this in open session versus closed session, and have a discussion in open session. If there's a need to go into closed session for negotiations or whatever, we can do that at a later time, but I think my preference would be err on the side of transparency. So if we can, Administrator Leonard.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I apologize, there's nothing in your packet because, again, as the chair alluded to, I wasn't entirely sure if you were going to go into closed or not, but I can give you the situation is relatively easy to lay out. So the county owns property at 405 South 8th Avenue in the city of Wausau. That is adjacent to, directly across the street from the UW Stevens Point Wausau campus. You are probably familiar with it. You drive by and it looks like a parking lot because that's how it was previously utilized. It's a large parking lot. Hasn't been really utilized in that form for some time. The university has expressed that it is not needed for operations from their perspective. This is one of the parcels that we, in fact, had talked about at this committee some time ago, and in fact, we then went and received an appraisal relative to that piece of property. That appraisal came back indicating the highest and best use for the property was residential housing, and recently we received an offer from the Wausau Community Development Authority indicating that they had the intent to utilize that property for redevelopment to address workforce housing needs. They offered a purchase price of $60,000. Within that offer, they indicated that the price took into account, from their perspective, an estimated amount of staff time for developer engagement and site demolition to ready that site for housing development, which they indicated they believed would amount to $40,000. The proposed closing date was November 1st of this year. The contingencies, the only contingency noted in the offer was that it must also be approved by the Community Development Authority. We do have a representative from the city of Wausau here to elaborate on any items relative to that offer or the county's consideration. In full transparency, based on some of the conversations we've had relative to the development of other parcels and approvals by the board, I raised the idea that perhaps there would be a discussion at this committee of a contingency that we would have that the property actually be redeveloped within a period of time. So I had a conversation with the interim development director, and he expressed no issues with utilizing 36 months, given the fact that they're going to try to use various forms of funding to do that. For that contingency that would allow, if development does not occur within that 36-month time frame, that the county would have the opportunity to purchase that parcel back for the amount paid less any direct expenses incurred in its redevelopment. So that is a quick overview of the state of affairs relative to that parcel.
And we have Tammy Stats from the Wausau Community Development Authority present. If there are any questions for her or any need for additional clarification? Chair Gibbs?
Just a question, is it single-family housing, condominiums, apartments? What are we talking about, the potential of developing there?
Thank you. That's a really good question. If the rezoning goes as we hope, we're anticipating to put a 6-unit apartment complex, and then we will work with a local nonprofit to manage the tenancy. They will maintain and manage it, so we can step back. I don't believe the city should be a landlord, but they have the expertise in doing that. So our goal is that if the rezoning does not go according to plan, we would probably try plan. I think we're on F, maybe even closer to Z, I don't know. Maybe we'd do a couple of duplexes. You know, we've got a couple of options that we can do.
Any questions? Supervisor Marshall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned an appraisal, but you did not give us a number for that appraisal.
That was intentional, just to make sure if you want to hear a number in closed session, you could ask, but I figured you'd ask. I'll pause and talk slowly for a moment so someone can make a motion if they want. Otherwise, I'll give you a number. The appraisal came back, market value at that highest and best use assumption at $99,000.
Supervisor Marshall?
Is it safe to assume that the 40,000 mentioned, that many of those costs they're going to have regardless if they're using staff time, right? I mean, they're going to incur those costs regardless. So I would look at the contracted costs to turn that into site ready as legitimate, but not the other costs related to staff time.
And I would certainly defer if Tammy wants to offer any additional information. I think that I anticipated you might have those questions relative to redevelopment.
If I can answer that, yes. We're working with Function as far as architectural services, so it's more of their costs versus ours. Yes, we would have to, no matter whether we're working on this or other things, yes, we're going to get paid. However, the redevelopment of this will take time. We'll have to have a couple of neighborhood meetings so that we can get the rezoning done. The rezoning will take time. Working with Function will take time. That will take us away from our other normal job. So funding is because of ARPA and the housing need. So it's a little above and beyond what we normally do, but we think it's a great opportunity to work with the county and get this parcel back to what it should be.
If I can offer one other piece that I neglected to, but one of the reasons that I did reach out to the municipalities of all these remnant parcels or parcels that the county no longer was necessarily desirous of maintaining or needed from an operational perspective, and this fits that bill based on the university comment that they no longer needed it. It is consistent with your resolution you adopted back in 2023, relative to housing. But to your point, Supervisor Marshall, really the question of what is the appropriate value that the county puts on that parcel, and whether or not the expressed offer meets that threshold is a policy question for this body and ultimately the board.
From my perspective, I think that we're trying to meet the needs of addressing the housing shortage in the community, and this has been a parcel that's been owned by the county for a considerable period of time, so we don't have a current basis to what we have invested in it unlike other tax delinquent properties if it was tax delinquent. But I think one of the concerns is that we would, if we do move ahead with this, we'd want to put a contingency on that the housing be developed within a time certain, for instance, 3 years. And if not, the county would have the ability to buy it back at cost plus to make sure that it is meeting the intent of the transfer. Any other questions? What are the wishes of the committee? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to approve the sale of the parcel for the offer, contingent on that it be developed into housing within 36 months, or reverts back to the county and is available to be purchased for the purchase price less any costs incurred by the county.
Is that a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion?
Just to clarify, relative to the motion, it was less any cost incurred by the county. What about the thing in talking with the housing director, the interim economic development director, if there were costs incurred by the city relative to redevelopment, but they didn't materialize and the county sought to exercise its option to buy it back, and they had done a bunch of site survey and site development work, they wanted to be compensated, at least have the purchase price be reduced by that amount, I think was their sense of what would be an appropriate
Supervisor
contingency.
Marshall.
It would be a great incentive to, if you did not reimburse for those, for that 3-year thing to not even come into play. So I would support Chair Gibbs' original motion.
Chair Gibbs?
Yeah, I think we're giving that part of that consideration on the reduced purchase price, and so that would be that was the reason for my comment, or the reason for my motion the way it was.
Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no? I'm too quick. That motion carries unanimously. All right, we will now jump back up to 5A in presentation of the annual budget. So if I could just, as we begin this process, the issue before us today is to accept the administrator's budget. It then becomes ours. And then we will then meet on Monday morning at 8:30 to consider amendments and authorizing it for publication. After the period of publication, we will then have a hearing. We originally scheduled it for November 7th, and the clerk reviewed the statutes, and we had to have it before the 4th, the Monday before the election, and the clerk, in light of the election the following day, requested that we look at a different time, so that public hearing is scheduled for Friday of November 1st at 3:30? 3 o'clock. So that's the context and the timeline. So with that, Administrator Leonard.
All right, thank you, Chair Robinson. Thank you, members of the committee, and certainly any other board supervisors who will be watching this. It is my pleasure, as always each year, to present the annual budget, and that's certainly true this year. So today we'll go through the 2025 annual budget as well as the 2025 capital improvement project funding plan. For your consideration, and as the chair laid out, really the process before you is just today to accept that budget for further consideration. But before I begin, I would be remiss if I didn't thank a couple of people that put these materials together for you and really assisted in developing the budget. Finance Director Sam Fensky, as was alluded to by Chair Robinson, she joined our team in July, dove right into audit, and now has seamlessly transitioned into budget. Has done a great job, her and her team. Molly Edzik, Human Resources Director, and her staff. in assisting with personnel budgets. Department heads and their respective teams did a fantastic job. Deputy Administrator Holman, who you'll hear from, I should say, in just a little bit relative to the capital improvement program and the funding plan. Data Officer Michael Schultz is in the back. I really wish I had time to go through all the departmental pages with you today, but I'm not going to do that in the interest of time. But there is what you'll see relative to data in this budget. I'm certainly very proud of the work that our team has done and that Michael has led. I think it provides a great deal of additional context relative to the programs and services we deliver and the kind of return on investment for those services and programs. And of course, last but not least, Sarah Severson, our communications wizard, as I alluded to before. She oversaw the logistics of getting all this information from all the departments, packaging it, putting it in here, and also had the very unenviable task of helping me craft and proofreading my various drafts of these sections. So she has done an exceptional job. So each year our goal that I've set for administration is to deliver a budget to you that is better in terms of context and layout and information than the budget before, the year before, and I think certainly we've done that. In the last 5 years, I think our budget, I don't know that length is a proxy measure for quality of budget, but our budget message historically was in the 25 pages. It's now up to a blistering 171. But I do think there's a lot of much better context and information. So in terms of what you're going to hear today, we'll go through the operational budget. I'll take the lead on that capital funding plan. Chris will give you some highlights of some key projects, including some areas where there are some areas that we didn't fund, projects that were not funded. Sam is going to talk to you about some of the new systems we utilized in this year's budget, and then also talk through a couple of documents that are in your appendix that will lay out first by fund, but then also by department, what those budgetary changes are year over year. And then, as the chair already laid out, we want to make sure that there are no questions regarding kind of what are the next steps relative to the budget in terms of the various the acceptance, the publication, opportunities for amendments both before publication and after the public hearing. So we'll try to do all those things. So in my comments, I'm really hoping to give you some highlights of the budget and talk through the process of putting the budget together. And really, when I talk about highlights, I think looking at it from the perspective of a taxpayer. The average taxpayer in Marathon County has been something we've done over the last several years, so I'll do that. Talk a bit about the strategy that was employed in building the budget, because each and every year we certainly have strategy that it goes into some of the tough choices that we have to make. And during that discussion, I'll talk about what guided us, talk about some of the adjustments that were made to balance the budget, and certainly highlight the impacts on our people, our infrastructure, and something that we've included the last several years, opportunities for innovation. And finally, throughout that process, I'll also try to do some of the things that Chair Robinson asked when we spoke earlier, and that is talk about the areas of concern or areas of risk that come up during the budget, and also just in terms of what is on the horizon relative to county government funding and how we sought to mitigate those risks to the greatest extent we could. And then again, I'll turn it over to Chris and Sam for a moment. So let's start with from the perspective of the taxpayer. I think first and foremost, when people are going to look at this budget, there's a recurring message, and that is, and I gave this to all the committees already, that it's largely a status quo budget, and that's not meant in any way to denigrate it. That's the nature of county budgets. They've been going on for a long time. We have set by statute the things we have to do and even the things we can do, and very often there are things we can't do. So our guardrails are set. So it is largely status quo. There weren't any what I'll call overly significant changes in terms of programs or services that the county directed me and my team to put into the budget. I'll just highlight a couple. Again, we went through and had those conversations with all of the standing committees for the last several months about what programs or services we deliver at what level and at what cost. So in terms of significant changes, I really wouldn't highlight any, but there were some more minimal changes. In the health department, we are expanding. The budget provides for a slight expansion of water testing at county-owned beaches at a projected annual cost of about $12,000. There's some expansion relative to lead mitigation efforts at the health department in connection with a grant that actually was received by the city of Wausau, where we would be the primary recipient of the funds. It's consistent and aligns well with our long-standing ongoing lead mitigation work. The Extension Education Economic Development Committee approved a approximately $3,500 membership fee in a regional tourism entity. So again, largely status quo. You gave me direction through the budget process of no new positions that were levy funded. And in fact, we've done that. I'll talk about positions in a little bit. The resounding theme I hope that all of you get, and certainly the taxpayers will get, that our team really did strive to listen to the direction you provided relative to the budget guidelines and assumptions, the budget priorities, and also longstanding policies you've had relative to things like rolling stock. You updated our rolling stock policy last year, essentially giving direction that we need to up the funding. That hasn't changed. The funding level for rolling stock hadn't changed for many, many years. So we strive to do that. We also strive to meet the board's direction relative to routine and end-of-life capital. As I alluded to before, we didn't fund everything. You'll hear from Chris, there were some tough choices and we made them, but those are still opportunities for this committee and the board to make some changes should you wish to do that, but it's nearly fully funding our routine and end-of-life maintenance. So I want to offer a thank you. You provided a great deal of clarity, the standing committees did, on what you were expecting, and we really did try to do that. So when you look at any budget, I think one thing that comes through is what does a particular budget say about the economic standing of our community or the health of the organization? Again, the message is we're in a very good spot. I think Marathon County, relative certainly to our peers in central Wisconsin, is on strong financial footing. You look at 2024 net new construction in Marathon County was 1.78%, down a bit from where we were last year at 2.32%, but still in a strong position relative to our peers. Equalized value growth, which, as you'll hear me talk about later, is kind of a double-edged sword. It demonstrates a strong real estate economy. We saw nearly 9% growth in property values, which equates to about $1.3 billion in value across Marathon County. So what does that mean as an individual taxpayer? I'll jump to the page on the document that is we have some charts here talking about what does this mean for the individual taxpayer. I alluded to this at all of the standing committee meetings. I didn't give numbers or exact numbers, certainly. The tax rate is going to drop to $3.78. That is a 21-cent reduction based on my proposed budget. It equates to a 5.26 reduction in that rate year over year, which is greater than the reduction that was approved as part of the budget last year. So what does that mean in terms of impact on an individual that owns a home in Marathon County? We relatively recently expanded our use of charts in the budget. You saw this last year. But historically, we've talked about what is the average home in Marathon County, and we've charted that since, I think it actually predated 2011. But you'll see the home price working up on that top chart from the bottom. So in 2025 over 2024, with that increase in property value of 8.51%, if you owned a home and it was $214,238, that average home in 24, it appreciated in value $18,232, assuming there's a lot of underlying assumptions to that, but that's how equalized value works through the Department of Revenue. So you saw a pretty significant increase in property value. That drives that rate down. But you'll see the change in the tax bill. There's still, nevertheless, an increase in that tax bill. Now, to give some context to that, if you look at the proportion, let's say, between the change in tax bill of $23.93 and the appreciation in terms of overall property value, that amount is certainly much less than what you'd otherwise expect. And a good way to demonstrate that is if you look in my write-up on the, I believe it's the preceding page, but it talks about the increase in that tax bill of $23.90 really represents about 13% of the overall increase in value. Stated differently, so if we applied the 2024 tax rate to the 2025 property value, we would see a new tax bill of $927.55. So that would be an increase of $72.74. So you see the impact of rising home values. What it actually does through levy limits is it drives down that rate. So that's what that top chart is seeking to demonstrate from the perspective of what may be your average homeowner. To show that a little bit differently, and this is likewise, each of these situations probably are, you struggle to find the exact person living each of these situations, but I think they're illustrative. The top one is your home value goes up by the exact amount of equalized value. The bottom one is that your home value doesn't appreciate in value at any rate. But it demonstrates how that drop in tax bill happens through net new construction, through equalized value increases. So the drop in rate from $399 to $378, your tax bill would actually go down if your home did not appreciate in value by over $30. So for context, I recently had a conversation with one of my colleagues, and he gave an analogy that I thought was good, and that is if you break down the value of county government based on your property tax bill, here in Marathon County, your monthly property tax bill would essentially be about, for that average homeowner, $73.23 a month. I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people that pay more for their monthly cell phone bill than what they pay when you break out your annual property tax bill on a monthly basis. So I think that speaks to the value that we get from funding our 22 departments and 4 intergovernmental agencies, everything from county highways, law enforcement, parks, zoning, you name it, the things that are funded by levy. That's a pretty substantial value. In terms of context, again, for how is Marathon County doing as a taxpayer, I think it's instructive to look at, again, our peers, which we tried to provide in my letter. We tried to provide a bit of context for our peers. I mean, the state of Wisconsin, if you look in the Green Book, sometimes numbers can lead you down a rabbit hole and perhaps not be as informative as you want. If we compare ourselves to another community, for example, Washington County, there are a lot of ways where Washington County is comparable to us. Population is the most clear. We are almost identical in terms of the total number of people in those counties. That said, our communities are very, very different. Property values in Washington County are substantially higher than they are here, which again drives that levy rate down. So their property tax levy is dramatically different than ours. So I think it's instructive to look again to our central Wisconsin neighbors. So I again included information relative to that. So you'll see our rate for the proposed budget is $378, and you look at what are the current rates of some of our surrounding neighbors, and that average is, there's a wide range, but the average is $4.92. So again, from a regional standpoint, I think the message to the taxpayer is we're in a good place. And actually, when you look at the state as a whole, Marathon County's tax rate, despite the fact that we're in the northern half of the state where we don't have the high property values, at least historically for sure we did not, that you get in a lot of other parts of the state, our per capita property tax is 16th lowest, which I think is a strong indicator of how we're doing. And when you compare that, I included per capita expenditures and per capita levy for our surrounding peers, you again get greater context. we don't have the density of people that in a lot of other areas of the state that they have. So that impacts that per capita tax levy. But from a per capita expenditure standpoint, across the entire state of Wisconsin, Marathon County is 13th lowest in per capita spending. And you can see that our per capita expenditures for county government relative to our surrounding peers likewise is quite low. And I don't mean that in a way that, again, we're not delivering high services. Quite to the contrary. I think the takeaway is that Marathon County is very intentional with its budgeting, very intentional with its spending, and we do provide a high-value service relative to cost. So having gone through those, again, the kind of the highlights from the perspective of the taxpayer, I want to again go back to what drove us in terms of strategy. Again, it's the direction from the board. I think that's one of the key takeaways when we did the new process a couple of years ago for budgeting, really to try to get early and often input from the board and its various standing committees relative to the direction you wish us to take. Those budget priorities, and guidelines, they are in the budget document itself, in Appendix B and C at the end of the document, because they drove our work. The assumptions are, again, in Appendix B and C at the end. That capital guidance relative to rolling stock, routine and end-of-life maintenance. And last but not least, we did take to all the standing committees the mandated program and service list for a number of months, answered any questions that standing committees might have, and also engaged and brought in each of the nonprofits that have historically been funded through the annual budget process for service contracts, and the board gave clear direction relative to funding those. So that really has shaped the budget itself. So let me give you a few examples of what that has looked like. On page 11 of the budget, there is our, pull that up here, our revenue. I'll start from the revenue perspective, the revenue guidance that the board has provided us. First and foremost in your budget priorities and guidelines, you said no use of reserves. So you'll see on page 11, I talk about our working capital. We did not spend from our general fund working capital reserves for purposes of this budget. There is additional information on page 40 of the document that you can look to see our historical use of working capital and how that's been graphically represented. But the board has, on occasion, utilized working capital. You did it in the budget as part of the 2018 budget, and in 2023. You had a substantial use of reserves in 2023. In 2019, it was done outside of the annual budget, but it was done via budget amendment to deal with large capital expenditures relative to the jail. So this year in the proposed budget, we did not, pursuant to board direction, we did not utilize those that source of revenue. Second, relative to revenue guidance, was sales tax. On page 37, we give you the historical data relative to sales tax in terms of revenue recognized, as well as what was adopted as part of the budget. To be very clear, the guidance we got was consistent with our longstanding practice of trying to be conservative in our budget forecasts. I won't belabor the point, but I do think that's sound policy. Having that sales tax, that cushion ensures that during tough times, if you don't count on sales tax to run all of your operations, you don't spend it all, that means you don't need to cut. Likewise, our local policy has taken forecasting relative to utilization for capital. It makes it unnecessary because your policy sets aside unutilized sales tax in the year following the audit to go to capital. What does that mean? Well, it means that instead of forecasting sales tax for capital resources, which again is good because it limits the need to borrow, and that's what sales tax was intended for, property tax relief. Instead of forecasting how much you want to spend, you know how much you have to spend because you conservatively budgeted in the year prior, you have the audit, you know exactly what is available and you utilize it. So consistent with the direction of the board through the budget assumptions, you set an assumption of $16 million for this year's budget, and we set that and we utilize that for the budget itself. 16 million in total sales tax. Apologize if I misspoke in terms of total revenue. Relative to another revenue assumption, state shared revenue, you gave us budget assumptions that very clearly outlined what we should expect, and they were accurate because we also kind of knew those numbers, so good for everyone. And, you know, the major takeaway here should not be surprising. Well, we did see a very welcome increase in 2024 with the 2023 Wisconsin Act 12 relative to shared revenue. Nevertheless, our partnership with the state on shared revenue is not in a great place in terms of equally sharing the load. Particularly if you go back beyond what's on this chart, it truly has not kept pace, with inflation. Aids have been generally flat. Again, very appreciative of the increase, but you'll see from the totals, even over those increases we had from 23 to 24, what we get in terms of additional shared revenue from 24 to 25. For an organization our size with a budget of nearly $200 million is not much, and I'll talk more about that later. So it's not a very reliable revenue to account for the increased costs that we have. Another revenue assumption that the board gave us very clearly, not only don't spend from the general fund working capital, general fund reserves, also we're not issuing new debt in connection with this budget. And we did not issue new debt in connection with this budget. That said, for context, we again provided a write-up and a couple of graphical representations beginning on page 16 through page 18 of our outstanding debt obligations. So what you'll see from the write-up itself, I won't go through the charts in detail, but what you'll see from the write-up itself, as we continue to pay down debt, and at the same time, the Wisconsin statutes, particularly 6703, sets forth what our debt limit is, essentially 5% of equalized value of taxable property, that we have a very large amount of debt that we could issue. Don't misunderstand that I'm saying, hey, we should issue a bunch of debt. No. I think the board has been very diligent and intentional in when to issue debt. And at this point, we don't have any truly large capital projects that require it, so it makes prudent sense not to. But you will see that we have a legal debt limit of over $850 million, and we're at about 10% of that limit for this coming year. Relative to expense guidance from the board, want to go to page 19, the way that through your guidance, through the budget priorities and guidelines, as well as the budget assumptions, you gave us a number of expense guidelines from which to operate as we sought to build the budget. Major takeaway, I certainly feel this way, and I took the board's direction to be consistent with this understanding. Our employees are our most valuable asset. When we talk about doing local government work, county work, it is a service business, and we require high quality, highly intelligent, hardworking people to do that work. And those people are our employees, so we need to make sure that we are remaining competitive to retain and attract the people to do this highly important work. So let's talk about some of those expense guidelines. You gave direction relative to new staff. Very clearly, no new levy-funded staff was the goal through the budget development process. We followed that process while at the same time bringing to you, through your existing ordinances, as you saw today, any new position requests that I felt of merit. So what you saw were two reorganizations, one within conservation planning and zoning and one within the highway department. So new positions were created out of that. However, at the same time, other funding, whether it was in the form of limited term employees or full-time employee positions, that funding was abolished to provide for that new reorganization, any new one position. Those came at a cost savings or essentially a wash. The direction that we've really tried to go is really identify how we can be as efficient as we can as an organization relative to our people, because as I said, they are our greatest asset. So we identified where needs were within those departments, developed a financing plan for any reorganization, and brought those to the requisite standing committees and ultimately to this committee, and those were approved. You also approved, it was approved at the Environmental Resources Committee, bless you, and also at this committee, the creation of one position within the solid waste department. From my perspective, that makes logical sense, and we talked about it at this committee. That is a position that, if we do our work right, it is going to not only pay for itself, but it'll maximize additional revenues through our renewable natural gas processing operation that should start in 2025 on the solid waste site. We timed the position. We will time, the position recruitment with that kind of onboarding of that operation. And then last, you just approved today the creation of an FTE position in the sheriff's office that, again, is largely offset with the contingency that we go back and look at making sure we're capturing our true cost for that position relative to the agreement with Rib Mountain. Last to note there, we did have 2 reclassifications, both within the district attorney's office. There was a request to essentially upgrade 2 positions from legal assistant positions to 2 paralegal positions. I supported that request from the district attorney, and that was brought to both public safety and this committee, and it is approved and in the budget, consistent with those recommendations. So moving on from FTEs, you'll see the FTE chart. A lot of notes to try to make it very transparent why those numbers are changed. We did, one of the benefits of upgrading your computer system on the finance side, certainly there are a lot of things we're working through, but on the HR side, we never had a formal system. We were tracking a lot of these where positions lived on paper or in Excel files. So this has been very helpful to have Workday, and we did correct some long-standing computational errors relative to positions. So you'll see that notation. Effectively, we're at about the same number of FTE as the year before. Compensation is another area that certainly is important, so I'll jump ahead to that and then I'll jump back to health insurance. I won't belabor the point, but you gave guidance of up to 3% in your initial budget priorities and guidelines. Your budget assumption was 3%. We built 3% in the budget. I will be very clear, I believe 3% is absolutely necessary. If there are concerns about 3%, please talk to me before any budget amendments. That will have an organizational impact. As I'll talk about later, individuals, just like our organization, are having significant pressures relative to workforce and inflation that, in my mind, absolutely warrant a 3% increase. The other part I'll talk about is we do have funding in our budget for next year to have a kind of re-engage a consultant to make sure that we're remaining competitive relative to our pay plan. That, again, was consistent with the direction and conversation we had with the board when we initiated and then also implemented our compensation study back in 2023. So keeping with the focusing on the employees as our most valuable asset, this is an area of risk that I know this committee has talked a great deal about, and that is health insurance. For Marathon County, I can say that health insurance, and this committee knows it well, is a very significant cost. You gave direction in your budget priorities and guidelines to maintain the quality of the plan, but make sure that we're evaluating delivery methodology and that employees share in the cost, any cost increases. So we budgeted 8%. That was in the initial budget assumption that ultimately the full board adopted. After a great deal of work and engaging with our consultant, we ultimately were able to get that increase down to 6, but we are budgeting 6.5. And I won't go into great detail, but essentially we're making sure we have the opportunity to fund our new clinic arrangement, which we'll hear more about later, but we are going to have a different independent clinic provider for our on-site clinic, which I think we certainly thank Aspirus for all the work that they've done for us and the relationship we've had, but we certainly are likewise excited to move in that new direction. So a bit of context on health insurance. Our plan, the employer share of the plan, is about $13 million annually. 6% is $750,000. For context, a number of surrounding counties had seen increases. The city of Wausau was projected an increase in the area of 20% or more. 20%, if we were to put things in context as to the relative risk, and there are a number of counties, my colleagues that I've talked to that are in this position, 20% for our employer share of our plan would be $2.6 million. Going back to what is the new revenue we see each and every year, net new construction for Marathon County with 1.78% is about $1 million. So I'll say again, 20% on the health insurance plan is 2.6. So we are I think we're in a great spot. Our team is very happy with the renewal. We're going to work. We think we can get that to flat moving forward over time, particularly as we kind of make some other choices that we've talked about at this committee relative to the health benefit, but really in a good place, certainly relative to our peers in this challenging market. Bouncing back to compensation for a little additional context, you'll see this in Appendix E, which is way at the end of the document. Our total payroll for Marathon County is, again, when I talk about our organization, is a people-focused organization, both in who is doing the work and the people that we're serving, is $72 million, a little bit above $72 million. Assuming, which is I think a pretty safe assumption, that our levy-funded payroll is about 60% of that overall number, 3%, a 3% increase equates to $1.3 million of the levy-funded portion. So again, it's vitally necessary, but to put our foreshadowing some of my future comments about the challenges on the horizon, when you're looking at net new construction of $1 million a year, and your personnel side is $1.3 million for increases and several $100,000 for health insurance. As I'll talk about later, there are strategic choices we certainly need to make in that regard. So moving then on to what is additional revenue, expense guidance. An area where we added to the budget in our last conversation was really around, in the previous budget, was really around this idea of inflation. It again gives context to some of the challenges we have. I included, again, won't belabor the point, but you'll see in some areas on this chart, you'll see expenses between 50 and even over 100% increases. That does put certainly some pressure on our facilities and capital management department, and I think it's important to, again, always be transparent with the board about what those pressures look like. But from a direction standpoint from the board, you gave clear direction. Do our best to fund routine and end-of-life maintenance. So you'll see in our capital plan, there's a lot of IT system upgrades that are end-of-life, roofs, roads, elevators, HVAC. But for context, we do have some challenges relative to inflation. I also certainly think that the direction you provided relative to issuing no new debt, very sound. I think we can continue that with our ongoing policies relative to sales tax and conservative estimates. But the risk is certainly there with increasing costs on the construction side. And I'll give you one example of how I think it's instructive we need to disavow ourselves of this idea that you're looking at a 2025 operational budget and then you're looking at a 2025 capital improvement plan, essentially a funding plan, and that they're wholly distinct. Because that's just false. Now, certainly the state statutes lead us to a way where we discuss these things separately, because the levy limits say you have operational levy on this side, and you have other levies that allow you to adopt other strategies, primarily debt levy, over here. But they are certainly linked, and I write in the budget message of a recent experience we had that demonstrates it, but I'll go through it rather quickly. So as you all know, we have done a great deal of facility work down at our Lakeview campus. We had a relatively new chiller in early 2024 that suddenly failed. And when our very diligent staff identified that, sought to get that fixed right away, what did we find? We certainly find inflation as a challenge. We're prepared for that, but we can't lose sight of the other fact that we also have seen significant supply chain challenges over the last several years. We were told it's going to be 6 to 7 months. So why is that important? We know we need to fix it. It's a capital expenditure, but let's talk about how that impacts the operational side. If we had a redundant chiller system, so one going down, we're still fine. We have a backup. But redundancy is good until the redundant fails, right? So let's talk about what would happen if that redundant fails. At the campus, based on administrative code provisions and occupancy rules, we would have to evacuate a very large portion of that campus if that second redundant chiller were to fail. That is not an option from an operational standpoint. So credit to Chris and his team, very promptly on it. Developed an interim solution, working very well with Jamie, sitting right over here from Corp Counsel on the risk side. And we had that fix in place. What we did was we had to rent a mobile chiller to be on site ready so that we didn't have to incur the operational expense, which would be very significant to Marathon County, very significant to North Central Healthcare, have significant issues relative to insurance, and a whole slew of other things. The cost of that is $30,000 a month. Now, thankfully, due to the very diligent and coordinated efforts of Jamie and Chris and their respective teams, as well as the timing of the failure of that chiller, we're not bearing that cost. That's being paid through other means. But it demonstrates that this idea of operations and capital as some wholly distinct budgeting operation is just false. You've also seen it at the library. The chiller being replaced at the library, or cooling system at the library, had very significant operational impacts on our budget relative to utilities. So just highlighting that, you gave very clear direction, in which we certainly appreciate. I think on the horizon, however, we need to make sure we look at the link between what really is an overall budget approach. And you'll see when Chris goes through the capital project plan, we actually did push out some things that you might otherwise think were more end of life to prioritize an operational benefit project earlier, namely a project at the highway department relative to brining equipment, because again, it will have an ROI on our operational budget side. So those again are the big risk is that on the revenue side and expense side, we're talking about our revenues are very limited with net new construction and our other limited revenue streams. On the expense side, inflation just continues to be a challenge, whether it's health insurance, whether it's compensation, or whether it's related to actual items. And you'll see relative to compensation, I put in there unemployment. it's still a tight labor market. So that impacts not only us as an organization, but also the costs we see from third-party vendors, which leads me into the comment of what did we do to mitigate risk? So we tried to do that in a number of ways. One is innovation, broadly speaking. You'll still see funding for McDevco in the budget. That's consistent with the direction from the board. But our mitigation efforts are really around trying to make sure we're creative with respect to controlling and providing opportunities for increased revenue. McDevco, new business development, sales tax, potential new property tax, the tourism partnership that the board funded, sales tax opportunities, more spending brings in more jobs, more sales tax, that brining operation I talked about, but also relative to mitigation of risk. I highlighted sales tax, reserve spending, and I want to highlight one specific reserve policy that I'm going to be bringing forward to this committee. I built the budget around this being adopted, and that relates to out-of-home placements. So if you, within your budget, and you can certainly read this at a later date, but on page 32, we continue our discussion relative to out-of-home placements. Social services spends about $6 million, just shy of $6 million annually on placements. This year we budgeted $5.82 million. I make very clear that in my message, and I'll say it here, yes, we budget for placements, but budgets don't determine placements. Judges determine placements based on the needs of kids. So the question when we look at budgeting is how do we provide an accurate budget that mitigates risk? Because when you look at these numbers, if you look in the middle, the average single placement cost, I'll just pick two. Level 5 treatment foster care, $596,865 a year for one placement. Correctional care, otherwise known as Lincoln Hills, $474,390. We have continued to, since I've been administrator, and I know under my predecessor we did the same thing, we spend a lot of time talking about placements and trying to budget tight. We budgeted tight this year. You'll see under correctional care, we budgeted for 0.5 of a child. That's really tight because you either have a child placed or you don't. And likewise on the level 5 foster placement, we budgeted 1. We budgeted tight across the board. So that comes with risk because these are high cost placements. So how do we mitigate risk? We're going to be bringing forward a resolution for consideration to this committee to establish a high cost placement reserve, essentially saying we want to segregate a portion of our social improvement fund dollars. And my initial thought was $400,000 for the sole and only purpose of high cost placements. We will budget tighter through the annual budget process. We will have that high cost reserve that then we can utilize as opposed to going to either contingency or the general fund. I thought that was a really good idea when we were having our budget meetings several weeks ago with social services. I'll tell you, I really think it's a good idea now because late last week we got an email from the Department of Corrections, the State Department of Corrections, talking about what their projected rates are for Lincoln Hills next year, and they went up 81.8% to over $800,000. So I think it's a really good idea to adopt a high-cost placement reserve. Perhaps $400,000 is a starting place to talk about what that should be at, because you can see if you have one or two, you budget for a half of a placement for half the year, I should say. Excuse me. And you end up having 2, that is a significant budget impact. And I think it's prudent, just like all of us as homeowners, you set aside, in the best case scenario, you set aside some funds to be able to take on those things that you don't necessarily plan for. So that was a big area of discussion that I think, again, really mitigates risk. And it's an adjustment that I highlighted starting on page 11 to balance the budget. And just to go through those really quickly before I wrap up and Chris and Sam can offer some additional information. We did a number of things starting on page 11 where I tried to summarize just some of the high points. In the sheriff's office, we really tried to guard against inflation within some of our third-party contracts, so we budgeted tightly there. Overtime budgeting as well. We reduced our overtime budget, assuming that our strategies are going to work. But that said, I think they're very sound strategies. We're going to have a contractual provider for what had otherwise been, I'll call, out of our institution supervision, like at medical facilities, if we have someone we need to supervise at a hospital while they're legally in our custody, rather than using overtime, which was historically kind of how we dealt with that. With the increased frequency of these things, we've secured a third party to do that. And also, speaking with Sheriff Billup, it behooves Molly, the sheriff, and I to sit down and really look at, does it make sense to add deputy positions to address what I'll call structural overtime? Do we have the right number of people? We made some reductions in their wellness budget, not to reduce overall wellness programming, but just to fund it in a different way. If we fund it from an organizational-wide perspective, we can use a different funding stream than levy. Still very much committed to those services, but really bringing those high level of services throughout the rest of the county. I already talked about social services with the high cost placement reserve. The flip side of getting a third party to deliver a service for you, social services, they did the evaluation, and we're going to take some services in-house to reduce costs. We had projected, we had budgeted at a number, and the contractual vendor was $100,000 above it. We had a lot of conversations about getting to the right number. They couldn't do it. We're confident we can, so we're going to change our delivery model to do that in-house. Number 4, our departments, for a variety of reasons, it was relatively common that individual departments would have casual staffing or temporary staffing budgets. Those were long-standing. As part of the effort to balance the budget, we had great success with, you'll recall last year's budget where we created a shared position between the clerk's office, aimed to help out also in the treasurer's office, but it's housed in Corporation Counsel because that's where most of the duties that we consolidated were. That seems to be working very well. So what I did was I consolidated all those resources, provided they weren't department specific or task specific in some way. For example, Kim's election worker budget, I didn't take that. I mean, that is a separate and distinct thing. But if we had casual staffing for just temporary office coverage or things like scanning, I pulled those, which amounted to about $300,000, along with one position that I'll talk about. That was included in this $300,000. And I'm going to develop a practice whereby if a department has those needs, we're first going to really understand what the need is and see if we can handle it through shared staffing. We also need to be very intelligent and intentional with respect to our light duty staff. We have a lot of staff, and a lot of staff do work that sometimes based on an issue, they can't go back and do that same work. So within those departments, they have projects for them to do. Well, let's really prioritize. Is that project in that department the most valuable thing we could be doing with that person, or could we do something else? So making good use of our light duty staff assigned to light duty work is another big part of that. And then lastly, the position that I referenced, we had a position in the clerk of court's office, used to actually be housed right adjacent to this room, that would help people navigate the courthouse. They were referred to as our switchboard position because they answered a lot of phone calls. Well, the needs relative to that position are fundamentally different than they were 10 years ago when I recall speaking with that person, because we have a central screening checkpoint. So a lot of people ask their question about, hey, where do I get at the front? Or quite honestly, they also ask Kim a lot. But even more importantly, people don't call a general information line nearly as much as they had in the past, and we have tools like a phone tree that can mitigate a lot of that. So I pulled that position. After speaking with the clerk of court, the needs were different. She supported that, and I put the funding for that position and the rest of that consolidated temporary staffing. That amounted to about $300,000. I didn't take all of it. Quite honestly, to balance the budget, gave 20% back, and I kept the remaining. It's about $235,000 to still meet the needs and evaluate what we need moving forward. I have to develop that process, though, that I alluded to. I kept to balance the budget. Last year, you'll recall that we instituted a $200,000 transfer from solid waste into the general fund. We're going to keep the transfer, but reduce the amount. For those of you that have watched solid waste meetings, solid waste management board, or at ERC, we have significant capital needs at the solid waste department. I strongly believe that a transfer is appropriate in light of the indirect costs that the county, as Chair Robinson referenced in a previous agenda item, that we cover for solid waste. And don't forget, solid waste is actually 3 counties. It's a partnership. It's all Marathon County employees in Marathon County, but we receive waste from Portage County and Shawano County. So we need to account for that. But those capital needs justified me dropping that down so that they can at least meet their capital needs moving forward. They'll build reserves, I'm confident, through some increase in tipping fees and through the renewable natural gas royalties that you're familiar with, but I did reduce that transfer for this year. And then importantly, this is an area certainly for discussion at the full board or this committee. I tried to fund all the things you guys told me to fund. I didn't fund the things that you talked about being important, but didn't give me clear direction to fund. There's been a lot of talk about broadband being important, and you've done a lot of work on broadband. I have a whole section on pages 27 through 29 about these things, but nobody said, there was no motion, nothing to say set aside X dollars for broadband. So I didn't. Similarly, workforce housing, property redevelopment, child care, addressing homelessness, or general economic development. There's been a lot of talk about all of those things. And I alluded, again, pages 27 through 29, there's a good overview. No motion to fund them, no request for a specific dollar amount, so they're not funded. That does not mean that there's no opportunity for you to fund those. And I write right in that section one potential way to do that. But that was an adjustment or a strategy, I should say, to balance the budget. I didn't have funding identified, didn't have clear direction, so that was the approach we took. Other adjustments I referenced in this section, fees. We did a lot of work on fees consistent with your direction from the board. And in fact, Appendix A in the budget, you'll see, I can just show you what it looks like, is it's a consolidated fee schedule for all of our departments, consistent with the approach that Brown County takes, how they lay it out. We did the same thing. We looked at our fees consistent with the direction of the board for if it was appropriate to increase fees 3%. That was our starting point. We didn't increase all the fees 3% for sure, because in a lot of instances that we had those conversations, it wasn't appropriate in speaking with the department head. Our costs weren't at that area, or we would actually negatively impact revenue. But we spent a lot of time in our budget meetings talking about fees. So I went way over time on my section, which is not unusual, I think. But I will turn it over to Chris to talk about the capital improvement program, and that's on page 168 of the budget book. And I will rotate this because it's tough to read if you do it that way. Sure.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I'll do a quick hop, skip, and jump through the capital improvement plan. I'll just start at the top and work down through it, but the two projects at the top are not funded by CIP, but they're a big chunk of the highway projects in terms of their bituminous surfacing projects and the culverts and bridge aid, which is a part of the county's levy, but not that does not fund federally funded and county funded bridges and culverts. So there's different funding streams for those, which are largely addressed in the highway section of projects below. Then you've got CWA, it's the Central Wisconsin Airport. They have an information only, so they keep us apprised of the capital projects they're working on. The total there is $14 million between the three projects they've got slated. And a lot of that's funded through the FAA, through grants and various revenue streams. Similarly, you heard about solid waste. They've got various capital projects in play and some equipment that they're needing to purchase, and so they use the funds that they have as the enterprise to purchase those. Nevertheless, we include those as the overall part of the CIP. For recurring projects, we've got county facility parking lot. I've been calling it the pothole and crack filling fund just to kind of add a little more definition to what that funding is doing. It's not replacing parking lots or anything like that, but really addressing when you have sinkholes or something next to drainage systems that you got to get in there and repair around the problem to fix. And I'm accentuating that because beneath there's a separate line that's just shy of $100,000 that is slated to finish the sheriff's parking lot here on the east side of the building. And we started work on the sidewalk there. And there's additional funding there that we'll be able to use on the west lot because the main parking lot coming into the courthouse the public uses needs to be redone. And so this year we redid the sidewalk along Dispatch and redid all the bollards. And then the funding here will allow us to kind of work on the other side of the parking lot so that you're framing the eventual larger project that can come in, and it'll lower the amount of time that lot is out of commission for staff or the public, because it will be a major impact as a primary entry point to the facility. Beyond that, you've got a couple CCITC projects, and we have a commitment within CIP to fund what they put forward. So up to 30% of the CIP funds made available go to CCITC first to ensure that we're funding IT at an appropriate level. And if there's a balance after that, then we can use those funds to address other issues. But the first step is fulfilling our obligation to them. Beyond that, you've got the rolling stock. So each of the rolling stock areas went up by 4.030%, which is the same percentage as it was last year after I did the calculations, and I did them 5 or 6 times just to make sure I didn't miss something. But nevertheless, the revised policy from last year has a formula that is either the net new construction percentage or the CPI average. And for many, many years, CPI the last 5 years was below net new construction. So you would take the one that's greater and apply that to help the funds keep up with what's happening out in the market. So the funds you see allocated over here are already increased by the percentage amount that you see there in red. These CCITC projects are what I was talking about previously. Then you jump into the projects that are submitted by other departments. So you've heard a lot about CPZ's update of the comprehensive plan. So this is in here at $50,000 to get that project accomplished. Same thing with the ortho imagery for online mapping, because the fees and other revenue streams they have coming into that work are not sufficient in the long term. So this is helping them to maintain that fund along with the other revenue streams they have coming into play to keep that work going at the rate that it needs to. Then getting into facilities, you've got the dispatch roof replacement. This is one of the last 3 roofs we have on the courthouse to do. So that's, I believe, the last ballasted roof. And ballasted essentially means layer with tons of rocks on it. But that roof is slated for being replaced, and then we'll move to the north for the last 2. The Lakeview Professional Plaza sanitary sewer replacement with bathrooms, that one was not funded. For a few reasons. This project has beleaguered us a bit in terms of scope, trying to get it drilled down, work with the engineers, but also it's there are people in the building now, and it's operating fine. We don't have an immediate need for people to go in there, but nevertheless, the county has heavily invested in this building, and this is sort of the last piece, aside from modernizing one of their elevators, which we took a piece out of this year, so that you could then have that building set for the next 20 years. But we can't put additional people in there until this project is completed. But priority-wise, it was lower than other areas. To wit, you've got the juvenile chiller replacement. This is a new one, so it's $225,000. This is the chiller that would impact the secure side of the juvenile facility and the non-secure side where social services operates the Youth Opportunity Center. So once we wound this down at the end of cooling season, it was very clear that there were numerous issues at play. And because it's an occupancy issue, similar to what Lance was talking about with the North Central chiller failing, this is something that leapfrog priority-wise is something that needed to be addressed. Then there's a design project that's essentially just teeing up the next stage for air handling units over in the jail. Highway projects, the highway does an incredible job of getting their numbers dialed in. The projects largely have a cost share, federal or state. So the cost share is reflected here in terms of what the county owes as part of those. You do see that highway did use $437,000 here because this project effectively doubled in price with the breakdown in cost. So then we made up the difference there. And I should also note that highway used reserve for additional rolling stock requests for a grader, a fuel truck, and they have 116 radios that are all essentially outdated. But that's the limit of the highway reserve fund use, which has been higher in past years. So that was good to see that we were able to limit that. But otherwise, the highway projects are all funded where they need to be. The salt brining operation, this is one that Jim was initially talking about possibly funding with ARPA, but we were able to fund it through this using the tax levy portion that rolled into the CIP program, and then a bit of the CIP rollover, the CIP specific rollover. So that's $945,000, but it affects the entire fleet and all the highway shops, and it has a 3 to 5 year return on investment. So it's a quick return on investment. It's good for the fleet. It gives highway a much more nuanced set of tools to address what's coming at them weather-wise. It reduces salt cost and it does reduce salt cost because you're using a lot less salt when you're doing brine. So that's a large chunk of where you make up the money in terms of the ROI. So a lot of people are moving towards brine in the state because effectively, if you want salt, you have to get in on a state contract and make sure you get whatever's coming in via Superior, because anywhere else you're going to get it, you're going to be paying through the nose. And on top of that, the cost for salt continues to climb year after year. So any ways to mitigate that, and this is a really good one, are going to be helpful in the near and long term. Moving into parks, the splash pad was a big priority for parks, primarily because the Marathon Parks had a water feature there for, I think, 100 years. But also, if you pay attention to Parks' Facebook page, which I do from time to time, the public was very upset about the splash pad not being there. So this was something that they were asking Parks about repeatedly, like, why is this not functioning? But in any case, that was a priority. The Rib Falls master planning, this is being funded through the remediation fund specific to that park. So that's why you see $80,000 over here and other. The Marathon Park road and trail repairs, both this one and the fence project, I phased out over 3 years, but because of funding limitations, we had to prioritize between the fence and the road and trail. The fence is a clear need, especially on the 17th side on the west. So this funding will tee up the first year of at least a 3-year project program. And then the road and trail repairs would just be pushed to next year's consideration to then start in 2026. The sheriff's office, largely elevator modernization. The county owns 20 elevators. Much of them are dated. So we were having to modernize many of them over the next several years, and none of it is cheap. But the jail is a high-use facility in terms of the inmates, the staff, the supplies, et cetera, et cetera. The Sallyport elevator in particular is a very complicated one as it's in the center of the building. So if that one were not to work, then you really wouldn't have any route to that. There's no real clear alternative to that elevator. So you could adjust, but anyway, that's the priority elevator to get done. And then we were able to throw in the JL Huber visitor elevator as well. The heat wheel and controls, if you don't know what a heat wheel is, it essentially is helping recover heat or cooling, depending on the time of year, to mitigate the amount of work that the chiller or the boiler has to do in order to get the temperature of the air coming into the facility where you've got it set. And so over time, utilities-wise, the heat wheel does present a pretty clear ROI, especially on larger square footages. I mean, it's very similar to what you'd find in somebody's home, but once you get to larger square footage spaces, then larger heat wheels really do affect how much power, how much the equipment is working. And then also there's the first floor VAV updates. These are just elements of the HVAC system that need updating because they're dated. And the second floor we've had to address this year because effectively the program was not allowing us to consistently control it. So people's offices were getting a little warmer than they wanted. The juvenile detention facility building envelope repairs, this is one we've pushed off for a couple of years. Now the facility is not falling apart, but the idea here is preventative maintenance. So we are at a point where we say, okay, it could go another year, but it's another one of those things that you really want to take serious look at next year, because once you start pushing these things, then you'll lose the preventative maintenance side, and then you'll have to have some higher cost fixes just because of things deteriorating. And then the last but not least, you've got the last phase of the central heating plant at the UW. So that will complete that project. And then, moving forward in future years, there's a couple things I think that would make sense from a preventative maintenance point of view, but you can really know that the core functions of the campus are in a good place. And then that tees up any other conversations there. The last thing I'll note is at the bottom line, you'll see on the far right, there's a $33 million number. That's the total of everything. The information-only projects, the unfunded projects, everything on the sheet amounts to that. The number on the left, the $16 million, that's actually what was funded out of the CIP program, including all of Highway's projects that, up at the top say they're not funded by CIP. But it gives you an idea of how much funding is in play next year. If you tally up the columns from here across, that's where you get the 16 million number. So that's your check on your math. And then the not funded line here is just over $1 million. So I too took a little longer than I was supposed to, but I do like to write a little context. So if you have any questions, happy to answer those.
So do we have a 5-year capital plan?
Yes, the 5-year capital plan was brought forward when the project list was there. What will happen as this moves forward, I'm refining the 5-year plan. So for example, if the Marathon Park Road and Trail repairs remains unfunded, that will then get adjusted in a 5-year plan. And my sense is that after you've adopted the budget, then you can get a 5-year plan that's been updated based on all the decisions made up to that point. And then that essentially sets the stage for the following year in terms of where things are at.
I think it would be helpful to have it in context of the budget, because you did push off some of the projects into subsequent years just to give us an idea of where we are going into others. So if you could expedite that.
Sure. I can bring something that reflects what you see here, if that's what would be helpful.
And one question relative to the budget and capital. In this committee, we had talked about energy reductions and trying to reduce by 5% our use of therms and BTUs and other things. Is there a corresponding reduction in the energy cost portion of the budget? And if not, how do we go about trying to achieve that, and particularly in light of some of the grants and the funding that's available on the federal level, so we don't miss our opportunity to impact future budgets?
Yeah, we did walk some money out of the utilities line. There's some volatility in there depending on which utility you're talking about, because we know that WPS is seeking some pretty sizable rate increases on the electric and gas front. Natural gas, you're buying essentially on the market, but what we've done there is implemented purchasing strategies that allows you to mitigate the peaks and valleys in the market as the prices fluctuate over time. That gets a little more complicated in terms of trying to drill down to something that you feel like you're winning on. The key there is to not lose. And so I feel really good about that in terms of where we're situated. For instance, over the next several months, we've got most of our natural gas volumes locked up at prices that will be lower than the market price as you get.
If I could stop you there, I don't think it is just the price of the energy. I think it's the utilization of energy, and I think I think we talked about an energy task force in the past. We've talked about other things, but one of the things that I'd like to see us try to do is look at how do we reduce the kilowatt hours, how do we reduce the therms in our county facilities, taking advantage of focus on energy and other things to try to drive down those costs in future years.
Every single project we do that has a focus on energy aspect, we consult with them. So we are in very good terms. We know our regional consultant and talk with them on anything, even down to jail kitchen equipment. And the reason I talk about price is just to say that when you have done a ton of new construction like you have, you achieve a lot of efficiencies with the newer equipment, but then as the prices increase due to rates, it's going to be mitigated by that. In terms of overall use, there's some things you can do. It depends on the area, and ASHRAE, the organization, effectively tells you what your temperature range has to be and things like that. We work within those ranges to be on the minimum side of that, but it still keeps you in a position where use is hard to drill down. In terms of looking at other projects, Supervisor Lemmer had sent me some information that I looked into where there's definitely projects that the federal government will effectively fund approximately a third of. But from my point of view, if you're talking about a $750,000 PV array or a ground source heat pump or whatever it might be, then having a clear sense of direction. I mean, I can put together their project and bring it forward, but I don't know if people, what the appropriate process for that would be in terms of, is there a particular angle you're interested in? From my point of view, you'd be wanting to focus on North Central or the jail. They are the highest users of utilities that you have. North Central is a little more restricted in terms of what you can do because they have tons of regulations in play. The jail does as well, but in terms of overall use, those are two areas where you could try to offset through net metering, which is the best it gets through Wisconsin Public Service, to try to offset some, further in terms of where you're getting the power generation from that you're using, which would have the impact on price. But effectively, if we said, okay, we're going to spend $750,000 on that, and this is what it looks like, the government will give you $250,000 of that back, which then accelerates your return on investment for how long it takes for net metering to catch up to what you paid, so that then between then and the end of so-called efficiency, call it 25, 26 years, you're able to recoup a lot of costs because you're generating a lot of the power at peak times. But
Chair Gibbs.
Just to expand a little bit on the projection, 5-year projection, Chris, if you could include in that, the projections, the end-of-year life projects and maintenance projects that we know of, so that we can look at those as far as planning potentially, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. That would be helpful.
Let me just start out by saying thank you to the administrator and his team for developing the budget and the hard work that went into it. The challenges associated with the new financial system being implemented over time.
Yeah, Sam is going to come up and kind of at least walk you through a couple of additional documents, so how you can understand what they are was helpful for me. So.
Good evening. So the first report to turn to is on page 169 of the PDF, and this is the budget by fund. So each fund, we have the tax levy portion pulled out with the operating revenues. So those are things coming from grants, program, any other sorts of revenues that they get for fees. We have the operating expenditures and the personnel expenditures also pulled out from each other by each fund. In here, you'll see the first one is the general fund, and that one is more sorted out in that next page on 170. And that will go by all of the individual departments. And then back on page 169, one thing to note with these is the social improvements and the parks funds are only, do not have any of their grants in there. That's included in the 291 grants fund. So in that grants fund, you will have grants for the administration, which is the Alternative Justice Program, CPZ, District Attorney, Emergency Management, Health, Medical Examiner, Parks, Sheriff, Social Services, and Veterans Departments. That first portion of the chart will show all of 2025's information, and then more towards the right, you'll have 2024 tax levy, so you can compare between the 2 years, and then the difference is listed there. So overall, the levy has increased $1,739,940. Again, one of the things that you'll notice on page 170 of the PDF is under treasurer, that acts like a contra tax levy. So as we get other revenue sources from, we had an increase in sales and use taxes. We also had an increase in personal property tax that was part of Act 12. That was $735,000. And then we also had the shared revenue increase of $199,000. So that's why that is substantially larger. The other place that I wanted to note throughout the budget book, thank you, is just as an example in there is page 49. We have the budget comparison. When you look at these, they should be in most of the departments. And it's just what's in their fund, so it does not include any grants. In the county administration here, you'll see the 2023 actual amounts. Those are taken from the system, so your actual revenues, your actual expenditures, your modified budget, so that's what was adopted, and then any changes that went through full resolution throughout the year. Where we are at as of June 30th of this year, and then the 2025 proposed budget with the changes.
So is the 6-month actual based on a projection through the end of the year?
No, that's just the actual as to where we were as of June 30th. Does anyone have any questions?
So just when you look at, as Sam alluded to, remember that grants fund piece is really important. That if a portion of a budget for a department is in the grants fund, there's a little disclaimer like on the bottom of each of the, there you go. Yep. Does not include revenue and expenses in the grant. We'll evaluate if there's a better way to do this next year, but just remember grants in the grant fund, they all zero out, revenue and expense. If we have a grant for $150,000, it is matched with, so the revenue of $150,000, there are $150,000 of budgeted expenses. So the grants fund always zeroes out. But we tried to give you, again, through this budget, additional context for each of the departments, like Sam alluded to. With that, Mr. Chair, just again, thank you for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions. I know in terms of process, you laid it out already, but we did put together, and we will circulate the budget amendment template that, Kim, thank you for your work on that. So if supervisors have a thought relative to a budget amendment, they can offer it certainly to this committee prior to your next meeting for you to consider before you adopt a budget for purposes of publication, or thereafter, whether it's before the public hearing or after, they can put together those templates. But I think we all went over time. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, first I want to thank the administrator and all the department heads and all the staff that worked diligently on this budget. I think what we have seen, through the development and the progression over the years is an improvement of an understanding and an improvement opportunity for the board to interact. So I really do want to extend my sincere thank you to administration staff and all of the departments that work so hard on delivery of a budget. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would make a motion to accept the administrator's budget along with the CIP program.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Again, this is transferring it from the administrator to the county board. Any questions? If not, all those in favor of accepting the budget will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. So are there, we're in a short turnaround. We've asked members to get in by Friday any proposed budget amendments. I think we might be somewhat flexible, but we would ask that anybody is thinking about a budget amendment work with finance and with corporation counsel relative to the drafting of it so that we can make sure that it is in the proper form and impacts the budget in a proper manner so that we're not exceeding the levy limits and others. So we will get out first thing tomorrow morning that, well, we'll get out a memo or an email to the board relative to the process and for that. So we are scheduled to meet again on Monday morning at 8:30 for the purposes of approving this for publication. That does not end the committee's jurisdiction nor the county board's involvement, but rather provides notice to the public as to what the parameters on the budget are. We can entertain motions to amend at that time prior to publication. We will also have up until the actual adoption of the budget to consider and review additional amendments, but we wanted to make sure that you had time, particularly in light of the fact that the budget wasn't available online until earlier this afternoon, for you to review and bring forth questions and potential amendments should you have any for Monday morning. So
If anyone has any questions outside of the meeting, certainly feel free to reach out. Happy to talk about the budget anytime. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
all right. Anything else relative to the budget or the timelines? I'm sure we'll have ample opportunity to talk about it going forward. All right, I think we're going to delay any discussion of the takeaways from the Counties Association annual conference in light of the time, but I would like to call on the administrator for an update on 7B relative to the on-site health clinic operations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I alluded to this in the budget discussion. We learned not all that long ago, but we learned that Aspirus, their provider at our on-site clinic, was going to be taking a different position. So that led to, as this committee knows, a number of conversations with Aspirus. And on September 26th, we were informed that we would have a new provider through October 14th. But through those conversations, it was mutually agreed between Aspirus and Marathon County that they would effectively be ending their on-site clinic operations for us on October 31st. So as I said, I want to thank Aspirus and certainly Tess Mickey, who was the provider on site for the last, for the foreseeable, or for the relatively recent past, I should say, for all their work. Certainly appreciated that. But after learning that information that they would be ceasing operations, and we learned that again Thursday, September 26th. The next day, we released a request for proposals for a new on-site clinic provider, and those requests for proposals are due Friday, this Friday, October 11th. So that is posted on our website. We communicated very promptly with employees relative to those changes. We're excited about the future opportunities, but we know that, I certainly know that this committee has great interest in the on-site clinic and how it impacts employees, and also is an effective tool for managing your health benefit costs. So keeping you informed of that, and we'll keep you informed of the responses we get and that selection process.
Are there any questions? All right. If not, I think we have our agenda set for the next month and a half. And if you have other items you'd like to bring forward, please let me know. But our next meeting is on Monday at 8:30. And in light of people's schedules, participation remotely is an option. I know it's tough for some people to come in, so we just appreciate your presence either virtually or in person. Anything else? If not, a motion to adjourn. I saw Supervisor Poole raise his hand. Motion by Poole, is there a second? Seconded by Lemmer. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no, that carries. Thank you. Couldn't resist.